A superhero movie just lost more money than most small countries spend on their entire film industry in a year. The studio behind it is telling everyone it's fine. The director and the studio secretly made two different versions of the same movie and tested them against each other like a science experiment. And somehow, the actress at the center of all of it is the one part almost nobody is blaming. That's Supergirl. And today we're not just going over what happened. We're going over why it happened, because the reasons are a lot weirder than the movie was bad. I've spent way too many hours of my life tracking opening weekends, so when a comic book movie faceplants this hard, I don't just want the headline. I want the spreadsheet behind the headline. So let's get into it. Supergirl opened on June 26, 2026. Budget: somewhere between $170 and $186 million, depending on which trade you trust, plus another reported $120 million in marketing. That marketing spend is not small. This movie had tie-ins with Ulta, KFC, and Cold Stone Creamery. Warner Brothers wanted this to be everywhere. Opening weekend: $37.1 million domestic. That's a soft number for a $200 million bet, but not a death sentence on its own. Movies recover from soft openings all the time. Here's the part that actually matters. Weekend 2, down 74 to 77%, depending on the source, landing around $9 million domestic. For comparison, a healthy second weekend drop for a superhero movie is usually somewhere in the 40 to 55% range. Supergirl didn't just drop. It fell off a cliff. Add it all up, and by its second weekend, the film sat at roughly $100 million worldwide. To break even, industry estimates put the target closer to $300 to $315 million. Some analysts are projecting a loss in the $85 to $120 million range once marketing costs are factored in. For context on how bad that actually is, this puts Supergirl in the same tier as Shazam, Fury of the Gods, which made $134 million on a $125 million budget, and 2015's Fantastic Four, which made $168 million on a $120 million budget and became one of the most infamous bombs in modern superhero cinema. Supergirl's shortfall might end up worse than both. This is the part that should worry DC Studios more than the raw numbers. Superman, the film right before this one, made $618 million worldwide in 2025. It was the highest-grossing superhero movie of that year. The assumption going in was simple: strong first chapter, built-in audience, smooth path for whatever comes next. That assumption just got tested and it failed. A hit movie one year does not guarantee a hit movie the next year, even in the same connected universe, even with a fan-favorite character making her debut in that first film. Millie Alcock's Supergirl got a huge reaction when she showed up at the end of Superman. That goodwill did not convert into ticket sales for her own movie. Audience enthusiasm for a cameo and audience willingness to buy a full ticket are two completely different metrics, and a lot of franchise planning treats them as the same thing. Now here's where it gets genuinely strange, and this is the part most casual moviegoers never even heard about. According to The Hollywood Reporter, DC Studios' new Supergirl wasn't testing well as far back as December 2025. Instead of a normal round of reshoots and trims, the studio did something much rarer. In March 2026, they ran what's called a bakeoff, testing two entirely different edits of the same movie against live audiences. One cut was from director Craig Gillespie. The other was assembled by the studio itself, under James Gunn and Peter Safran. Gillespie's version reportedly ran 11 minutes longer and leaned more into the villain, Krem, played by Matthias Schoenaerts. When both versions were shown to test audiences, the scores didn't go up like a normal test process is supposed to produce. They went down. Sources say neither cut ever broke out of the 60s on a 100-point scale, with one insider putting the film's ceiling at a 70. The studio's cut narrowly beat Gillespie's by about 2 points, and that's the version that ended up in theaters. Think about what that means. This wasn't a case of one flawed edit getting fixed. This was two different creative visions tested side by side, and audiences responded lukewarm to both of them. That's a script and story problem, not an editing problem, and no amount of post-production tinkering was ever going to fix that in the time they had. There's an added layer here, too. Supergirl was the first DCU feature not written or directed by Gunn himself. It was supposed to prove the studio could produce hits without Gunn's direct hands-on involvement in every stage. Instead, it raised the opposite question, whether DC's new model depends more on Gunn personally than anyone wants to admit. That let's talk about the comic the movie is based on. Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow. It's a beloved, fairly dark, emotionally complex story, and it's part of why fans were excited the moment this adaptation was announced. But adapting a beloved comic is a double-edged sword. Reviewers pulled some of the movie's strongest moments directly from that source material, and also pointed at the ending as one of the weakest parts of the film, specifically because it diverges from what made the comic work in the first place. When you announce you're adapting a specific, well-loved story, you're setting a bar. Move too far from that bar, and the built-in fanbase feels shortchanged. Stick too close, and you risk a pacing problem if the comic structure doesn't translate cleanly to a 2-hour runtime. Supergirl seems to have landed in an uncomfortable middle, familiar enough to invite comparison, different enough to draw complaints. Here's a smaller detail, but it's a pattern worth flagging. Superman's flight scenes were scrutinized heavily back in 2025. Some viewers felt the visual effects looked unfinished or artificial, and that discourse followed the movie all the way to release. Supergirl has now run into a strikingly similar complaint, with reviewers singling out a late film flying shot that echoes the exact moment that divided audiences in Superman. 2 movies in, and the DCU has the same visual sticking point both times. That's not a coincidence anymore. That's a technical and creative choice the studio keeps making the same way, and it keeps getting the same mixed reaction. If a third film hits this same wall, that's a pattern that gets its own headline. James Gunn is famous for soundtrack choices. Guardians of the Galaxy built an entire identity around them. Supergirl tried the same trick, including a cover of Jimmy Eat World's The Middle scoring a major action sequence. The reaction was split. Some viewers felt the songs were packed in too close together, and that the choices didn't land with the same impact as Gunn's previous work. This matters more than it sounds like on the surface. A signature style only stays a signature style if it keeps working. The needle drop approach became a Gunn trademark because it consistently paid off. The moment it stops paying off in a specific film, you get exactly what happened here. Online arguments over whether the studio is now leaning on a formula rather than building into the story naturally. Here's the part one think deserves more attention than it's getting. The DCU made a deliberate choice from day one to spotlight lesser-known characters early. Creature Commandos, the upcoming Clayface movie, and now Supergirl, a character whose only prior solo movie was a box office failure back in 1984. That's a genuinely different strategy than what Marvel did in its early years, and what the old DC Extended Universe did too. Both of those leaned almost entirely on the most recognizable names first. The upside of DC's approach is real. Less risk of superhero fatigue, more room for creative swings, characters that haven't been overexposed. The downside is what we just watched happen. When you don't have 20 years of built-in recognition doing marketing for you for free, the entire burden shifts onto the movie itself, and onto however many tens of millions of dollars get spent convincing people to care in the first place. Supergirl had a 76 to 77% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes from verified ticket buyers. Genuinely solid, but it didn't matter because not enough people bought a ticket in the first place to generate the word of mouth that usually saves a movie like this. So here's the encouraging part, at least if you're rooting for this franchise. Peter Safran told the New York Times directly that Supergirl didn't meet our box office expectations, but confirmed the studio isn't scrapping its long-term plan because of one underperformer. That matters because the old DC Extended Universe used to do the opposite, panic after every mixed result and rewrite the entire roadmap, which is a big part of why that version of the franchise never found stable footing. The current slate stays intact. Superman, Man of Tomorrow, directed by Gunn himself, is set for July 2027, bringing David Cornsweet back to the lead role. The Batman, Part 2 follows that October. Both of those carry far less first outing risk than Supergirl did, since both already have a built-in audience and, in Gunn's case, direct creative control from the start. Oh, what do we actually learn here? A strong movie before yours doesn't guarantee your movie succeeds. Audiences evaluate every release on its own merits, not by association. A beloved comic is a strength and a trap at the same time, and how closely you adapt, it will always divide someone. A visual effects issue that gets noticed once and not fixed becomes a pattern the second time it shows up. A signature style, like a great soundtrack, has to keep earning its place in every new film, not just get repeated because it worked before. And building a franchise on lesser-known characters is a genuinely bold, admirable strategy, but means every single film has to do more work than a franchise built on already famous names, with zero margin for a shaky test screening process. None of that means the DCU is in trouble. One underperforming film, even a big one, is not a universe-ending event, especially when the follow-up plan doesn't change out of panic. But it is a real, expensive lesson, and the fact that DC seems to be taking it as data rather than as a crisis might be the most important detail in this entire story. That's where things stand right now. If you want to see whether Man of Tomorrow proves this was a one-off stumble or the start of a pattern, that's a conversation worth continuing when more footage drops. Subscribe if you want to be here for that breakdown, and drop your own read on what went wrong in the comments. I read all of them.